forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything while reading this work, and for any noises in the background. This is Chapter 6, Part 1 of Passerine. Our trigger warnings for this chapter are manipulation, depictions of violence, and aftermath of violence. There would be no grand speeches this time, Tubbo knew. Instead, they formed a grim line like souls waiting at the gates of the underworld. They would find either judgment or absolution. The only sounds were tired murmurs and quiet thuds as the surviving soldiers of the Royal Army piled what remained of their camp into carts and wagons. Both the wounded and the dead were placed gently on beds of hay, with blankets covering the worst of their injuries, a futile courtesy for an army that had seen worse just the day before. They'd found a few survivors during their search last night, but as Tubbo had feared, they were mostly corpses to carry back. Sometimes not even a whole body, sometimes just an arm, a leg, a single strand of hibiscus pink hair, a wrinkled hand still clutching a blood-stained broadsword. A few volunteers would stay at the valley to continue the bleak search, but for most of the Royal Army, Tubbo included, it was time to head home. Home. He'd only left a few weeks before, but he could barely conjure it up in his mind. It seemed to him like everything before the war was vague, unfamiliar relic, preserved behind a fogged glass. As much as Tubbo pressed against it, he could only see hazy glimpses of what lay behind, a fractured memory of a quiet town, a small house at the outskirts, his family. He'd left for the war in the middle of the night, with only a hastily scribbled letter left on his sister's bedside table to explain where he was going, what he wanted to do. "I will protect this kingdom, protect you." He wondered if she could still recognize him, when he could no longer recognize himself. Wasn't that what family was for? Weren't they supposed to know him, even if, especially if, he felt like a stranger in his own body? Tubbo tipped his head up to the sky, letting the faint rays of dawn warm his frozen limbs. They had had a terrible storm last night, but the only traces of it today were the dewdrops clinging to the grass and the mud slick beneath Tubbo's boots. He shook himself out of his reverie. There was more work to be done. There was always more to be done. Slowly, Tubbo weaved around the bustling panoply of people in carts, helping where he could, tying down boxes of supplies, feeding the horses and checking their brindles, rewriting someone's arm sling, anything that kept him moving, anything that distracted him from the gnawing feeling in his gut. He looked over his shoulder at the valley behind him, expecting to see a green-clad soldier crawling across the rubble towards him, reanimating by vengeance, but there was nothing but open air and a flock of birds circling lazily overhead. Carrion crows or vultures, it didn't matter which. They would be feasting well today. Instinctively, Tubbo's eyes found themselves drifting down, and that's when he saw them. A simple horse-drawn cart, indistinguishable from its neighbors aside from the two people stood over it like mourners at a grave, a king and a general, twins in their misery. Tubbo felt an odd pang in his chest as he realized who exactly was in that cart, who exactly they were saying goodbye to. As Tubbo watched, the king leaned over the cart as if he was going to pull himself in with his dead. But then he pulled back, his shoulders trembling and his hands deep in his pockets. Tubbo wondered if they were shaking too. For a moment it seemed as if the general might reach towards the king, but instead he pulled something from his own pocket and reached into the cart. Then he leaned away. His hands were empty and still. The general nodded at the king, and then they were off, disappearing down the hill and heading north, the opposite direction of home. It might have been a trick of the light, but Tubbo would swear until his deathbed that he saw one of the birds wheel away from its flock, its obsidian wings gleaming as it trailed their two-person procession. But then he blinked. The king, general, and the bird were gone. And though Tubbo knew the affairs of royalty were not his to investigate, he found himself walking towards the cart, pulled towards by a gravity he could not ignore. In between one breath and the next, Tubbo was staring down at the face of the dead prince. Tubbo had seen 100 corpses. They'd fallen against him during the battle, or he'd pulled them free from the rock and the dirt, but few had looked as peaceful as the prince in death. It was almost as if he was sleeping, his mortal wound hidden by his clothes and red and blue coat tucked up to his chin. His head rested against soft hay, a shade darker than his own golden hair. Tubbo could almost see himself shaking the prince awake, and the prince would blink drowsiness from his eyes, ask Tubbo who he was, and Tubbo would say, "A friend, and maybe in another life that wouldn't be a lie." Tubbo's cheeks felt warm. He knew he must be crying. He knew he must be sad, but for whom? Who was he even mourning? His kingdom's prince? Yes, but the harsher truth, a stranger. A stranger whose laughter still faintly echoed in Tubbo's head like a half-remembered song from a distant childhood. A stranger who gambled his life for his kingdom and lost it in a heartbeat away from his victory. If this bitter thing could even be called that. A stranger that felt like no stranger at all, but a stranger nonetheless, Tubbo reminded himself. And through a blur of tears, Tubbo saw what the general had left behind, tucked gently behind the prince's ear like a final offering, a single yellow rose. It would be a long journey. It had taken the Green Army more than a month to make the same trip, but as Techno had pointed out, they'd been slowed by their foot soldiers and their sheer numbers. Techno and Wilbur had neither. With 2 horses Techno had smuggled from the camp, they could maybe have the time if they rode like hell, but it still wouldn't be fast enough for Wilbur. Each minute was another where he hadn't saved his brother yet, and each second crashed against him like waves wearing a cliffside down into pebbles and chalk. He was glad he didn't bring a pocket watch with him. Its constant ticking would have driven him to madness. "As if you were not mad already," the voices cooed. But they were almost drowned out by the wind whistling past Wilbur's ears as he spurred his horse on faster, following the pink banner of Techno's hair flying behind him as he rode ahead. He tied his hair back in a simple knot, where there would be no intricate braids for a long while, no flowers heavy with meaning. Wilbur had come to realize that death wasn't a single yawning chasm, but a collection of small puncture wounds slowly tearing through the mundane. But he'd fix it. They would fix it. Wilbur had known at once what the Green God had meant by his invitation. There was only one place he could be inviting them to, the place that started it all, the place the voices had whispered about in self-satisfaction tones, where the Green Army had first struck, the town at the northern border. It was only fitting that Wilbur's first grand failure would be where he would rewrite the second. The Green God would bring his brother back, and all would be well. The specifics Wilbur would figure out later, but for now he would ride. The north was a brutal land. Wilbur had averted his eyes as they passed underneath the shattered points of the mountains that bordered the blue valley, but the smell of blood and sulfur had stayed with him until they broke into the tundra beyond. And then there was simply nothing, just open air and rolling fields of grass caught between the green of life and the fading reds of death. There were no towns, no cities, no travelers to meet them on the overgrown path that only Technoblades seemed to be able to follow. They stopped only to rest their horses. Once, with the sun right above them, they'd stopped under the shade of a boulder, leaning against its craggy surface with their shoulders slightly touching. Techno had pulled his shirt over his head to wring the sweat out of it, and Wilbur had caught the sight of bruises and wounds that marred his old friend's wiry body. "You're staring," Techno accused, without turning around to face him. "Just thinking," replied Wilbur, his gaze catching on a particularly nasty scar running down the length of Techno's spine. "I always thought gods were invincible, but you're just as breakable as humans, aren't you?" Techno scoffed, pulling his shirt over his head once more. "Maybe not just as. A killing blow for you would be a scratch for me. So whatever left those scars on you, they were awful then." Techno was silent for a moment. "I've lived a very long time, Wilbur," he finally said, glancing at Wilbur with an indecipherable gleam in his eyes. "Awful things come with the territory." Wilbur swallowed, unsure where he wanted to take this conversation, but unwilling to let go of the vulnerability that Techno so rarely shared. "But gods can be killed. Filza, he killed the war god." Neither of them missed the tremor in Wilbur's voice as he named his brother's killer, or the hesitation in which he said his father's name. But they both silently elected to ignore it. Techno took a tentative sip of his water canteen, squinting in the distance as he thought. "It would take a considerate amount of force to kill a god," Techno said slowly, his brows furrowing. "And your father, Phil, he's that strong, huh?" Wilbur tipped his head back and searched the skies until he found the distant speck of his father hovering overhead, his obsidian wings spread wide. They had not spoken more than a few cautious sentences to each other since the night of his father's return, but Wilbur knew it would be a long time yet before he could look at his face without feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. Wilbur had built stories around the man for years, justifications and explanations and vicious scenes where Wilbur screamed at him until his very lungs gave out. In a way, Wilbur was disappointed because Philza had turned out to be in the right. He'd left to save his sons, and now his abandonment was outweighed by the fact that he could bring Tommy back. How could Wilbur begrudge him for that? Wouldn't he have done the same? It's hard to hate someone when you saw sense in their actions. But darn if Wilbur wasn't going to try his best anyway. This isn't forgiveness, he told his father. He never added, yet. Even the mere possibility of absolution, Wilbur thought, was more than Philza deserved. I died years ago. Wilbur shot Techno a confused glance, but Techno was still staring straight ahead, his eyes unseeing. That's what the war god said, I think. I think it was easier to kill him then. I think he let us do it. Techno closed his eyes, and suddenly a gust of wind blew through the tundra, raising the hairs on the back of Wilbur's neck. Vengeance is a powerful motivator, but it's like a fire you have to keep feeding, or else it burns out, or burns you. He offered the canteen to Wilbur, who took it and brought it quietly to his own lips. I think the war god simply ran out of kindling. Or maybe he just got tired of tossing shirt into the flames. Techno let out a breathy laugh. Guess we'll never know. He pushed himself off the rock and began heading towards their gazing horses. If you keep stalling with dumb questions, we'll reach the border by the time you're dust and bones, and I really don't want to be bargaining for 2 dead people. One is already a hassle. Wilbur threw the canteen at his head, but Techno caught it in the air effortlessly without looking back. Show off, Wilbur grumbled, but he was smiling for the first time in what felt like centuries. This won't last, the voices reminded him as he followed Techno back to their mounts. The stage is set for tragedy, Prince. This hungry audience will accept nothing else. Screw you and your stage, Wilbur thought, catching Techno's eye as the general hauled himself up onto his horse. Once upon a time, Wilbur would have cowered at the echoing threats inside his head, but now he stared right back at the monster, and he refused to be the first to flinch. And they rode on. They slept under the stars, or more accurately, Wilbur slept, fruitfully, tossing and turning in with nightmares. It would be naive to think he would find peace anywhere, even in this oblivion of sleep. It had been his call. If it had been his call, he would have ridden through the night without pause, but Techno had vehemently vetoed the idea. Wilbur had tried to argue, but Techno was quick to shut him down with, "You are useless to me, sleep-deprived." Over the years, Techno had come to learn that the only way to get a man like Wilbur to concede was to cut deep and cut fast. By the way Wilbur's jaw tightened, Techno knew he'd hit his mark. He would apologize, but if he were to be honest, he'd do almost anything to get Wilbur to rest. Despite the divinity in his veins, even Techno felt like he was fraying at the edges. He couldn't even begin to imagine what the past weeks had done to a mortal like Wilbur. Wilbur had begrudgingly slid down from his horse and laid himself on the cold ground of the tundra with a pile of blankets. "I'll keep first watch," Techno said, knowing he wouldn't wake Wilbur until dawn. Wilbur nodded, knowing the same, and by the time Techno heard the telltale signs of a winged god's descent, Wilbur was asleep. Techno spared Philza a glance as he settled himself against a pile of their supplies. His blonde hair was wind-tossed and his clothes ruffled, but for a man who'd spent the day closer to the sun than the highest soaring birds could even fathom, there was relatively nothing out of place, except his eyes. Techno had never seen a god more weary, but then again, he hadn't looked in the mirror in a while. "Already thinking about leaving again?" Techno mused. Philza tore his gaze away from Wilbur's sleeping form. "No," was his simple reply. Techno stared at the man before him, wishing he could believe him. Philza sighed as he sat down on the grass, tossing his leg under himself. For a while there was only the howling of the winds to fill the silence and the distant squawk of a bird in the hunt. And then Philza said, "What was he like?" Techno looked up from where he'd been idly pulling at the grass beside him, but Philza was looking at Wilbur again, his expression unreadable in the dim moonlight. Wilbur's face was a pale thing, and under that pile of blankets it was as if he wasn't even breathing. Techno looked quickly away. "What do you mean?" Techno prompted when Philza seemed contented to stare at his son until morning. Blinking slowly, Philza amended. Tommy. What was Tommy like when he was growing up? Techno's nails dug into the dirt. Neither Techno nor Wilbur had spoken Tommy's name. Philza hadn't spoken it at all, mostly because he was determined to keep as much distance as possible between him and Wilbur. For whose benefit, Techno didn't know, but now the name sat between them, as heavy as a curse, as hopeful as a prayer. Techno turned Philza's question over, treading the line between the truth and what he wanted to say. There was not much overlap. His son's childhood was a luxury Philza had squandered away the moment he wrote that pathetic excuse of a goodbye letter, and it would take more than a few weepy conversations during a storm to crawl back into Wilbur and Techno's good graces. Eventually, Techno shrugged. Tommy was Tommy. Philza nodded, as if he understood enough. But how could he? He'd left when Tommy was 6, and returned just in time to watch Tommy die. Tommy had lived a life, however short, between those 2 points. Philza didn't know pretty, petulant, passionate Tommy. Brave, bold, belligerent Tommy. He hadn't been there to watch Tommy grow up, hadn't been there to teach Tommy how. That was all Wilbur, and Techno. Techno pulled a fistful of grass from the earth and tossed it lazily into the air. The wind picked up and blew it all north. Techno thought his words over until the grass leaves disappeared into the night. He was loved. That's the only thing you need to know. Philza tipped his head up in the stars, and Techno turned away before the first of the tears could fall. Thank you, Techno. And they rode on.